The sound reaches you first. The hollow echo of footsteps that aren't your own, moving through corridors where no one has walked in decades. Then comes the groan of a door somewhere in the darkness, hinges protesting against the weight of years and neglect. These are the sounds that greet those who dare to enter the forgotten places, the abandoned institutions that dot our landscape like scars on the collective memory. We stand now at the threshold of two very different worlds that somehow share the same shadows. On one side, the schoolhouse, where laughter once filled halls now thick with dust and silence. On the other, the asylum, where suffering left its permanent mark on walls that seem to remember everything. Both abandoned. Both haunted, whether by actual spirits or by something equally powerful, the weight of human experience crystallized into legend and fear. This is a journey into those empty spaces where childhood innocence meets institutional horror, where the mundane transforms into the mysterious simply by being left behind. We're going to ask a question that matters more than whether ghosts are real. We're going to ask why these particular buildings, schools, and asylums have become the cathedrals of our darkest stories. Why do we tell these tales? What do they say about us, about our fears, about the things we'd rather forget but somehow can't? The answers lie waiting in the shadows, in the peeling paint and broken windows, in the stories people whisper and the histories they've tried to bury. Every school has its ghosts. Not the dusty remnants of history lessons or faded class photos lining forgotten hallways, but something far more immediate, whispered about in hushed tones at lunch tables and sleepovers. These are the stories that travel from older siblings to younger ones, passed down like secret knowledge, growing more elaborate with each retelling. And if you ask adults about the legends they believed as children, about the dares they accepted and the rituals they performed, many will tell you about bathrooms. Specifically, they'll tell you about mirrors. There's something about school bathrooms that makes them perfect incubators for ghost stories. Perhaps it's the institutional tiles that echo every sound, turning a dripping faucet into something that sounds almost like footsteps. Maybe it's the fluorescent lights that flicker and hum, casting shadows that seem to move independently. Or it could be the simple fact that these are liminal spaces, places where children go alone, away from the safety of classrooms and teachers, where the familiar rules of the school day briefly dissolve. Sarah Martinez remembers the bathroom on the second floor of Lincoln Elementary School in Cedar Falls, Iowa, with perfect clarity, even though she hasn't walked those halls in more than 30 years. When I speak with her over the phone, her voice takes on a different quality as she describes it, something younger creeping into her tone. The bathroom had 6 stalls, she tells me, painted a pale yellow that had probably been cheerful once but had faded to something closer to the color of old newspaper. There were 4 sinks, and above them, a long mirror that ran nearly the entire length of the wall. But it was the last sink, the one closest to the door, that mattered. That was Mary Catherine's sink. That's what the kids called it in 1987, and that's what they'd called it for decades before that. Mary Catherine Morrison had been a student at Lincoln Elementary in the fall of 1954. According to the story that Sarah heard from a 6th grader named Jennifer, who heard it from her older brother, who claimed his teacher had confirmed it, Mary Catherine had been 9 years old, a 4th grader with blonde hair she wore in 2 braids, tied with blue ribbons. The details were always specific, always consistent. The blue ribbons mattered somehow, though no one could quite say why. The story went that Mary Catherine had been sick, not with anything dramatic or sudden, but with something that the doctors couldn't quite identify, something that made her tired, that kept her out of school for weeks at a time. When she did attend class, she was pale, almost translucent, the other children said. She spent a lot of time in that bathroom, washing her face with cold water, trying to feel normal, trying to push through whatever was happening to her body. One October afternoon, during a spelling test, Mary Catherine asked to be excused. She never came back. The teacher, Mrs. Henderson, sent another student to check on her 20 minutes later. They found Mary Catherine collapsed on the tile floor beneath that last sink, her head resting against the cabinet, those blue ribbons still perfectly tied. The official cause of death was listed as a heart defect, something congenital that no one had known about, something that could strike at any moment. But the children of Lincoln Elementary, both then and in all the years that followed, knew something different. They knew that Mary Catherine hadn't really left. They knew she was still there, waiting by her sink, visible only under the right conditions, only if you knew how to look. By the time Sarah Martinez was in 4th grade herself, the ritual was well established. You had to go to the bathroom alone, which meant waiting until just before the lunch period ended, when the teachers were distracted and the monitors were busy elsewhere. You had to stand at the last sink, Mary Catherine's sink, and you had to turn on the cold water. Not too much, just a trickle. Then you looked into the mirror and said her name 3 times. Mary Catherine. Mary Catherine. Mary Catherine. What happened next varied depending on who was telling the story. Some kids claimed you'd see her reflection standing behind you, still wearing her 1950s dress with the Peter Pan collar, those blue ribbons bright against her blonde hair. Others said the water would run red. A few insisted that if you were really unlucky, really caught her attention, you'd feel cold fingers on your shoulder, or hear a voice asking if you'd seen her mother. Sarah tried the ritual exactly once, on a dare from her best friend Amanda. She was 10 years old, and she didn't believe in ghosts, or at least she told herself she didn't. But standing in that bathroom, with the water running and her own face looking back at her from the mirror, something shifted. The light flickered. Just for a second, but it flickered. And in that moment of dimness, Sarah could have sworn she saw something. Not a girl, not exactly. More like the suggestion of movement, a displacement of air, a sense that she was no longer alone. She didn't wait to say the name 3 times. She turned off the water and walked back to class quickly, not quite running but close to it. When Amanda asked what happened, Sarah lied and said nothing, absolutely nothing. But she never used that bathroom again for the rest of her time at Lincoln Elementary, even if it meant being late to class, even if it meant walking to the other end of the building. Now, decades later, Sarah can laugh about it, but there's something in her laughter that isn't quite comfortable. She tells me that she knows it was probably just her imagination, the power of suggestion, a child's mind primed to see exactly what it expected to see. But then she pauses, and in that pause is the same uncertainty she felt at 10 years old. Because the thing is, she says, the light really did flicker. And the feeling of not being alone, that wasn't like anything she'd imagined. It was colder than that, more concrete. The story of Mary Catherine Morrison is remarkably well documented, at least the factual elements. A girl by that name really did die at Lincoln Elementary in October of 1954. The local newspaper from that time confirms it, a brief article tucked away on page 7 of the Cedar Falls Gazette. The details match the legend almost perfectly, which is unusual for playground folklore. Usually, the truth and the story diverge wildly, but not in this case. What isn't documented, of course, is everything that came after. The haunting, the mirror sightings, the ritual. These elements belong to oral tradition, passed down through generations of elementary school students who likely never met Mary Catherine, but felt they knew her intimately. Michael Chen, who attended Lincoln Elementary in the early 2000s, nearly 50 years after Mary Catherine's death, confirms that the legend was still very much alive during his time there. The details had evolved slightly. In his version, you had to flush the toilet in the 3rd stall 3 times while saying her name, then look in the mirror. But the core remained the same. A girl in 1950s clothing. Blue ribbons. A presence that felt both sad and slightly threatening. What strikes me most about these accounts is not whether the ghost is real, but what the ritual represents. Children testing the boundaries between the known and unknown, the safe and the dangerous. The bathroom at Lincoln Elementary became a threshold space, a place where normal rules didn't quite apply, where you could perform an action that might, just might, pull back the curtain on something beyond everyday reality. Dr. Elizabeth Cho, a folklorist at the University of Minnesota who studies contemporary legends, tells me that school bathroom hauntings follow remarkably consistent patterns. The ghost is almost always a young person who died tragically. The summoning ritual nearly always involves mirrors, often combined with water, darkness, or repetition. And the experience itself usually involves a moment of genuine fear, followed by ambiguous results, nothing definitive enough to completely confirm or deny the ghost's existence. These rituals, Dr. Cho explains, serve a developmental purpose. They allow children to experiment with fear in a controlled environment, to test their courage, to bond with peers over shared experiences that sit just outside adult supervision and understanding. The bathroom becomes a proving ground, and whether or not you see the ghost matters less than the fact that you were brave enough to try. But there's something else happening too, something deeper. These ghost stories, particularly ones like Mary Catherine Morrison's, give children a way to process death and loss. Elementary school students are often too young to have experienced significant mortality in their own lives, but they're old enough to know it exists, to feel its shadow. The Ghost Girl becomes a safe way to encounter that reality, to think about what it means for a life to end too soon, for a person to leave behind unfinished business. The tragedy of Mary Catherine's story makes her sympathetic even as she frightens. She's not malevolent, according to most versions of the legend. She's just there, still waiting, perhaps still trying to return to class, perhaps looking for her mother who must have been somewhere in the building when she collapsed. The blue ribbons, those specific, tender details, make her human. They make her someone's daughter, someone who wore what she was told, who tried to be good, who didn't deserve what happened to her. Robert Williams attended Lincoln Elementary in the 1970s, and he tells me about a slightly different version of the ritual. In his time, you were supposed to bring something to leave for Mary Catherine. A ribbon, preferably blue. A note saying you were sorry. A small toy or trinket. You'd leave it on the edge of the sink, say her name, and if she accepted your offering, the water would run cold, colder than it should have been able to get. Rob, now in his late 50s, admits he left a note once. He was 9 years old, struggling with his grandmother's recent death, unable to articulate his grief. The note said simply, "I hope you're okay now." He folded it carefully, left it by the sink, whispered Mary Catherine's name once, not 3 times, because he was too scared to complete the full ritual, and ran. When he came back the next day, the note was gone. The janitor had probably thrown it away, he acknowledges. But part of him, even now, wonders if maybe Mary Catherine took it with her wherever she goes when she's not reflected in that mirror. These are the stories that shape us, that lodge somewhere in our memories and influence how we see the world. Sarah Martinez, Michael Chen, Robert Williams, all of them carry Lincoln Elementary's ghost with them, not as trauma exactly, but as part of their personal mythology, a reminder of a time when the impossible seemed just barely possible, when a bathroom mirror could become a portal, when speaking a name could summon the dead. Lincoln Elementary School still stands in Cedar Falls, though it's been renovated several times. The second-floor bathroom remains, though the sinks were replaced in 2015. Current students, I'm told, still know about Mary Catherine Morrison. The legend persists, adapting to new generations, remaining vital and immediate even as the world changes around it. The mirrors still hang on the walls. The water still runs cold. And somewhere, children are still gathering the courage to say a name 3 times and see what happens next. The iron gates of the former St. Augustine's Elementary School stand perpetually ajar, frozen at an angle that suggests someone left in a hurry and never bothered to look back. Beyond them, a cracked asphalt path winds toward a 3-story brick building that has watched the seasons change in silence for 23 years, its windows like vacant eyes reflecting nothing but the slow march of decay. This school closed its doors in the spring of 2001, a casualty of declining enrollment and a shrinking tax base in what had once been a thriving working-class neighborhood. The building itself dates back to 1927, constructed during an era of optimism, when the city's steel mills ran day and night and families poured into the area seeking the promise of stable employment. For 7 decades, children filed through these halls, their voices echoing off the high ceilings, their small hands wearing smooth the wooden banisters of the central staircase. Then the mills began to close, families moved away, and the neighborhood that had sustained St. Augustine simply evaporated like morning fog. What makes this location particularly compelling to those who study abandoned places is how quickly it was forgotten. Unlike some closed schools that undergo lengthy debates about repurposing or demolition, St. Augustine seemed to slip from the collective memory almost immediately. The building was locked, the utilities disconnected, and the structure left to stand as a monument to better days. No developer ever showed interest in the property. No community group rallied to save it. The neighborhood that remained was too depleted, too scattered, to mount any meaningful effort at preservation. Marcus Chen, a security guard contracted to perform periodic checks on abandoned municipal properties, first reported unusual activity in the autumn of 2004. According to his documented reports filed with the city, he began to hear sounds emanating from within the building during his evening round. At first, he attributed the noises to the wind or perhaps animals that had found their way inside through broken windows. But the sounds, he insisted, had a distinctly human quality. He described hearing what sounded like dozens of children's voices rising and falling in unison, as though reciting something in rhythm. The phenomenon occurred most frequently around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a detail that would prove significant when later witnesses came forward. Chen's reports were initially dismissed as the overactive imagination of someone working alone in desolate surroundings. Security work at abandoned properties can be isolating, and the mind often fills empty spaces with phantom sensations. But Chen was not easily deterred. He began recording his rounds with a handheld audio device, hoping to capture evidence of what he was experiencing. The recordings, which he shared with local paranormal research groups, contain long stretches of ambient noise punctuated by moments that are harder to explain. In one particularly unsettling sequence, a rhythmic sound resembling the clapping of many small hands can be heard, followed by what might be laughter or might be the creaking of old pipes. Audio forensics are imperfect tools, and skeptics can always point to alternative explanations. But Chen remained convinced that something within St. Augustine's was trying to communicate. Urban explorers began to take notice around 2007 when photographs of the building's interior started circulating on forums dedicated to documenting abandoned spaces. These weren't the typical empty room shots that populate such collections. The classrooms at St. Augustine's appeared to have been left in remarkable disarray, as if students and teachers had simply vanished mid-lesson. Textbooks lay open on desks, their pages yellowed and warped by moisture, but still legible. A cursive alphabet strip clung to one classroom wall, the letter Q dangling at an angle where the adhesive had finally failed. In the gymnasium, a basketball sat deflated in the center of the floor, surrounded by a perfect circle of dust, as if nothing had disturbed it for years. What struck many visitors was the smallness of everything. The desks designed for elementary-aged children seemed impossibly tiny, their wooden seats worn smooth by generations of fidgeting students. Coat hooks mounted at child height lined the hallways, some still holding forgotten jackets that had stiffened with age and neglect. In the cafeteria, trays were stacked beside serving windows that would never again dispense rectangle pizza or cartons of milk. The building felt frozen in a moment when childhood itself still happened here, when the potential of young minds filled these rooms with energy and possibility. Sarah Blackwood, an urban explorer who visited St. Augustine's in 2009, described an experience that added another layer to the growing collection of witness accounts. She and 2 companions entered the building on a gray November afternoon, armed with cameras and flashlights. They spent nearly 2 hours photographing the decay, documenting the peeling paint that hung in long strips from the walls, the ceiling tiles that had collapsed into soggy piles, the mold that bloomed in dark corners like malignant flowers. As they prepared to leave, standing in what had once been the main office, they all heard it simultaneously, the clear, unmistakable sound of a handbell ringing 3 times in quick succession. The sound, according to Blackwood's written account, seemed to come from directly above them, from the 2nd floor. All 3 explorers stood motionless, listening as the echo faded into the building's heavy silence. Then, as if triggered by the bell, they heard footsteps. Not the heavy tread of adults, but the lighter, quicker patter of children running. The sounds moved through the ceiling above their heads, from one end of the building to the other, as though a classroom had just been dismissed and students were rushing toward the stairs. Blackwood and her companions did not wait to investigate further. They left the building quickly and did not return. The 3 p.m. bell became a recurring element in subsequent reports. Multiple witnesses, visiting on different days and in different years, described hearing a bell ring at or around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The consistency of this detail is noteworthy. St. Augustine's, like most elementary schools of its era, had dismissed students at 3:15 each day. A handbell would have been rung at 3 o'clock to signal the end of the final instructional period, giving teachers and students 15 minutes to gather belongings and prepare for departure. If time can somehow imprint itself on a location, if routine repeated thousands of times can leave an echo, then perhaps 3 o'clock carries special significance within these walls. A paranormal investigation team from the regional university spent 3 Nights Inside St. Augustine's in 2012. Led by Dr. Elizabeth Morton, a psychologist with an interest in environmental perception, the team approached the location with both skepticism and careful methodology. They set up recording equipment in multiple classrooms, monitored temperature fluctuations, and documented their experiences in real time. Their findings, published in a journal of anomalous studies, were cautiously worded but intriguing. The team recorded multiple instances of unexplained sounds, including what they classified as childlike vocalizations, footsteps, and the ringing of a bell. Temperature drops of up to 15 degrees occurred in specific locations with no apparent environmental cause. 2 team members independently reported seeing a shadowy figure moving through a second-floor hallway, a tall silhouette that one described as resembling a woman in a long skirt. The stern teacher figure mentioned in this sighting matches a persistent legend about St. Augustine's. According to former students who attended the school in its final decades, a teacher named Miss Catherine Reeves had taught 6th grade at the school for over 30 years before dying of a heart attack in her classroom in 1994. Students remembered her as demanding but fair, a woman who accepted no excuses and held her pupils to exacting standards. After her death, even before the school closed, there were whispers among students about seeing Miss Reeves standing in the hallway outside her old classroom, arms crossed, watching, as though still monitoring for misbehavior. Whether this legend influenced what paranormal investigators later reported seeing is impossible to determine, but the consistency of the description is noteworthy. The physical decay of the building has accelerated in recent years. Water infiltration has caused extensive damage to the upper floors, where ceilings have collapsed and exposed the skeletal framework of the structure. Graffiti now covers portions of the lower-level walls, tags and messages left by visitors who sought to mark their presence in this forgotten space. Yet even amid the vandalism and deterioration, traces of the building's former purpose remain. In one classroom, a student's drawing still clings to a bulletin board, a crayon rendering of a house with smoke curling from the chimney, now faded nearly to invisibility. In another room, someone had written on the chalkboard in perfect cursive, "We are the future." The words remain legible beneath a layer of dust, a message from a past that never arrived, a promise left unfulfilled. What haunts St. Augustine's, if anything truly does, seems less malevolent than melancholic. Witnesses do not report feelings of terror or the sense of being threatened. Instead, they describe sadness, a heavy atmosphere of loss and abandonment. The building feels like a place that still expects children to arrive, classrooms that still wait for lessons to begin, hallways that anticipate the thunder of small feet at dismissal time. The phenomena reported here, the phantom sounds and shadowy figures, might be understood as the building itself refusing to accept that its purpose has ended, that the future it was built to shape has moved on without it. The neighborhood surrounding St. Augustine's continues its slow decline. Houses that once sheltered factory workers and their families now stand vacant or in disrepair. The corner store where students once bought candy has been closed for over a decade. The playground across the street where children waited for school to start on warm mornings is now just a flat expanse of cracked concrete, its equipment removed years ago for safety reasons. The school building remains the neighborhood's most prominent structure, a brick monument to an era when this community thrived, when the future seemed secure, when the voices of children promised continuity and hope. Stand before one of these buildings today, and you might feel it before you understand it. That peculiar weight in the air, that sense of something immense and deliberate looming overhead. The asylum architecture of the 19th century was designed to make you feel exactly this way, though perhaps not with the dread that accompanies it now. These were buildings constructed with a philosophy, raised stone by stone with genuine hope woven into their foundations, intended to heal rather than harm. Understanding how they transformed from temples of progressive treatment into monuments of human suffering requires us to journey back to a time when mental illness was just beginning to be seen as something that might be cured rather than simply hidden away. The story begins properly with Thomas Story Kirkbride, a Quaker physician who would become one of the most influential figures in American psychiatry, though his name is largely forgotten today outside academic circles. In 1844, Kirkbride took charge of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane and began developing a revolutionary approach to both treating mental illness and housing those who suffered from it. His ideas would eventually crystallize into what became known as the Kirkbride Plan, a comprehensive blueprint that governed not just architecture, but an entire philosophy of care. These weren't merely buildings he was designing. They were therapeutic instruments, carefully calibrated machines intended to restore sanity through their very structure. The Kirkbride Plan mandated a specific architectural form, one you could recognize from miles away. A massive central administration building formed the heart, usually 3 to 5 stories tall, topped with an imposing cupola or tower that announced the institution's presence to the surrounding countryside. From this center, wings extended outward and backward in a characteristic V-shape or shallow echelon formation, like enormous arms reaching across the landscape. The longest of these facilities stretched for more than a quarter mile from end to end. The Traverse City State Hospital in Michigan measured over half a mile in length. These were among the largest buildings in America during their era, structures that dwarfed most everything around them except cathedrals and capitol buildings. But this design served purposes far beyond mere grandeur. The staggered wing arrangement meant that every ward, every room had access to sunlight and fresh air. This was critical to Kirkbride's vision. He believed firmly in the curative powers of natural light, proper ventilation, and beautiful views. Each wing was meant to house a different class of patient based on their condition and behavior. The further from the center, the more disturbed the residents. The most volatile patients occupied the furthest wings, the most recovered those closest to the administrative heart. This allowed for a graduated system where patients could literally progress through space as they improved, moving step by step closer to the center, closer to cure, closer to leaving. The corridors deserve special attention because they reveal so much about the intentions behind these structures. Kirkbride specified that hallways should be wide, high-ceilinged, and long, sometimes stretching 300 feet without interruption. These weren't merely passages between rooms. They were exercise galleries where patients could walk during inclement weather, spaces designed to feel open rather than confining. The cross-ventilation these long corridors provided was considered essential. Air needed to move through these buildings, pushing out the stale and corrupted atmosphere that Kirkbride associated with illness, drawing in the fresh countryside air that might restore health. Modern historians, examining the plans, note that the ventilation systems designed into these buildings were genuinely sophisticated for their era, with carefully positioned windows and shafts that created natural air currents throughout the structures. The external appearance was equally intentional. These buildings were meant to inspire awe, certainly, but also hope. The architectural style most commonly employed was Gothic Revival or Victorian Italianate, styles associated with churches, universities, and the finest homes of the wealthy. The message was clear. These were not prisons. These were not warehouses for human refuse. These were hospitals, institutions of healing, places worthy of architectural dignity. The patients within deserved beautiful surroundings, grounds landscaped with gardens and walking paths, views of pastoral scenery that might calm troubled minds. Kirkbride himself specified that no asylum should house more than 250 patients, believing that larger populations would make the individual attention necessary for moral treatment impossible. Moral treatment, that was the key phrase, the revolutionary concept driving all of this. Rather than chains and cold water and casual brutality, moral treatment proposed kindness, occupation, routine, and dignity. Work in the gardens, conversations with gentle attendants, regular meals, clean clothing, respect. The idea seems almost painfully obvious now, but in an era when people with mental illness were often confined in cages or simply chained to walls, this represented a genuine paradigm shift in thinking. For a time, it worked, or seemed to. The early Kirkbride institutions reported cure rates of 70%, 80%, even 90% in some optimistic accounts. These numbers were almost certainly inflated, based on selective admission of patients most likely to improve, but the intentions were sincere. Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, opened in 1878, stood as a crown jewel of the Kirkbride philosophy. Built atop Hathorne Hill overlooking the town, it embodied every principle of the plan. The main Gothic structure with its soaring central tower could be seen for miles. The building contained intricate woodwork, high ceilings with decorative molding, and rooms flooded with natural light. The grounds eventually encompassed over 500 acres of farmland where patients could work and wander. But something terrible happened on the way to this therapeutic utopia. The numbers began to shift in ways that made the original vision impossible to sustain. Danvers was designed for 600 patients, maximum. By the early 1900s, it housed over 2,000. By the 1940s, over 3,000 people were crammed into spaces meant for less than a third that number. This pattern repeated itself at virtually every Kirkbride facility across the nation. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia was designed for 250 patients when it opened in 1864 after years of construction delays caused by the Civil War. By the 1950s, it held over 2,400 people. The hallways that were meant to serve as airy galleries became sleeping quarters, with beds lining both walls. Rooms intended for 2 patients held 6 or 8. The beautiful grounds became overcrowded yards with nowhere near enough space for the population they now contained. What happened? Several factors converged. Immigration swelled American cities with populations that strained all social services. The eugenics movement created pressure to institutionalize people deemed unfit or defective, vastly expanding the population considered suitable for asylum commitment. Laws made it disturbingly easy to commit someone, sometimes requiring only the signature of a single physician and a family member's request. People were sent to asylums for epilepsy, for alcoholism, for postpartum depression, for simply being difficult or inconvenient. Women were committed by husbands who wanted to remarry. Immigrants who spoke poor English were diagnosed as mentally deficient. The definition of who belonged in an asylum expanded, while the buildings themselves could not. The staff ratios tell the story in stark numbers. Kirkbride recommended 1 attendant for every 10 patients, maximum da. By the 1930s and 40s, ratios of 1 attendant to 30, 40, or even 50 patients were common. At Willowbrook State School in New York, opened in 1947 on Staten Island, the facility designed for 4,000 patients swelled to over 6,000 by 1965. Staff ratios reached 1 attendant for every 60 residents. The patients, many of them children with developmental disabilities, lived in overcrowded wards that reeked of urine and feces, with minimal clothing, inadequate food, and virtually no medical care or therapeutic intervention. The buildings themselves began to rot. Maintenance budgets couldn't keep pace with the massive structure's needs. Plaster crumbled from those once beautiful high ceilings. Ornate woodwork warped and split. Windows broke and went unrepaired. The heating systems, always inadequate for buildings of this size, failed regularly, leaving wings freezing in winter. Leaks went unfixed, creating pockets of mold and decay within the walls. The architecture that was meant to heal became part of the machinery of suffering. By the mid-20th century, the Kirkbride asylums had become everything they were designed not to be. Overcrowded warehouses where people were sent to be forgotten. The treatments evolved too, but not in directions Kirkbride would have recognized. Insulin shock therapy, metrazole-induced seizures, hydrotherapy that involves strapping patients into tubs for hours or days, ice baths, and most notoriously, lobotomy. Danvers State Hospital became one of the primary sites for prefrontal lobotomy in America. Thousands of people had their brain tissue deliberately destroyed in operating rooms located in wings that were supposed to be spaces of gentle healing. The patient population of American asylums peaked around 1955, with approximately 560,000 people institutionalized nationwide. Then came deinstitutionalization, driven by multiple forces converging in the 1960s and 70s. The development of antipsychotic medications like chlorpromazine suggested that people might be treated in the community rather than locked away. Exposés, like the 1972 Willowbrook report by Geraldo Rivera, showed the American public exactly what these institutions had become, broadcasting images of naked children covered in their own waste, rocking endlessly in barren dye rooms. The civil rights movement extended to mental health, establishing that people couldn't be confined indefinitely without treatment and due process. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963 promised a network of community-based care centers that would replace the asylums. The great Kirkbride buildings began to empty. By the 1990s, most had closed entirely. The populations that once numbered in the thousands dwindled to hundreds, then dozens, then none. The buildings were simply abandoned, too expensive to maintain, too contaminated by history to repurpose easily. Denver stood empty for years before developers purchased it in 2005, demolishing most of the complex despite passionate opposition from preservationists. A few sections of facade were incorporated into apartment buildings, now occupying the site, fragments of the original vision embedded in modern housing. This history matters for understanding why these places carry such weight in our cultural imagination, why they appear so persistently in our ghost stories and horror films. These buildings were constructed with hope and intention, with genuine belief that architecture itself could heal the mind. Their transformation into houses of horror represents a particularly painful type of failure, a fall from idealism into nightmare. The ghosts that allegedly walked these corridors are real in the sense that real suffering occurred here. Real people spent decades confined in spaces that promised healing, but delivered only warehousing and often cruelty. When we talk about asylum hauntings, we're not just discussing spooky stories. We're confronting places where the gap between intention and reality became a chasm, where hundreds of thousands of vulnerable people were subjected to conditions that we now recognize as torture. The architecture remains as evidence, those long corridors and staggered wings still recognizable in the ruins, still testifying to what was meant to be and what actually was. There are places in this world where history and horror have become so intertwined that you cannot separate one from the other, where the weight of human suffering has soaked into the walls like a stain that will never wash away. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Jefferson County, Kentucky, stands as perhaps the most documented and investigated paranormal location in America, but its ghost stories are only half the tale. The other half is written in medical records, death certificates, and the desperate screams that once echoed through these corridors when medicine had nothing left to offer but hope and morphine. Construction on Waverly Hills began in 1910, during an era when tuberculosis was sweeping across America like a biblical plague. They called it the White Death, consumption, the king's evil. By whatever name, it killed 1 in 7 people in the United States and Europe during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The disease attacked the lungs, causing victims to literally waste away, coughing up blood and pieces of their own deteriorating tissue until their bodies simply gave out. There was no cure. There was barely even treatment. And Louisville, Kentucky, was being devastated. The original Waverly Hills was a modest 2-story wooden structure designed to accommodate 40 to 50 tuberculosis patients. Within a decade, it became horrifyingly clear that this would never be enough. In 1924, construction began on the massive Gothic structure that still dominates the hilltop today, a 5-story monument to suffering that could house more than 400 patients at its peak. The location was chosen specifically for its elevation and isolation. The prevailing medical theory of the time held that fresh air, sunlight, and rest were the only treatments available for tuberculosis. Patients would be wheeled out onto the open-air porches regardless of weather, left to freeze in Kentucky winters or swelter in summer heat, all in the desperate hope that exposure to the elements might somehow purge the infection from their ruined lungs. What the architects and doctors could not have anticipated was just how many people would come to Waverly Hills to die. Historical records suggest that at the height of the tuberculosis epidemic, the death rate at Waverly Hills averaged 1 patient per day. Some estimates place the total death toll over the sanatorium's operational years at 64,000 souls. 64,000 people who came to this hilltop seeking healing and found only suffering and death. The staff at Waverly Hills faced an impossible psychological challenge. How do you maintain hope among patients who are dying when they are constantly reminded of death all around them? The answer was the tunnel. Officially called the supply tunnel, it was constructed to connect the main hospital building to the heating plant and laundry facilities at the bottom of the hill. But the tunnel served a darker, more practical purpose. It became known as the body chute, or the death tunnel, a 500-foot passage carved through the hillside where the dead were transported away from the living. Imagine the logic that created this system. Orderlies would place bodies on a motorized rail car, or simply drag them down the sloping concrete passage, removing the deceased through the tunnels, while surviving patients remained unaware of just how many of their fellow sufferers were dying around them. The tunnel descends at a steep angle, enclosed by dripping concrete walls that amplify every sound. Even today, when paranormal investigation teams walk through the death tunnel, they report an overwhelming sense of despair. The feeling of unseen hands touching them and disembodied moaning that seems to come from the walls themselves. Whether these experiences are supernatural or simply the psychological weight of knowing what horrors occurred in this passage is a question each visitor must answer for themselves. But the body chute was not the worst thing that happened at Waverly Hills. In the years before antibiotics, doctors grew increasingly desperate to save their patients. They experimented with procedures that seem barbaric by modern standards. Thoracoplasty involved removing ribs and muscle tissue from the chest cavity to collapse infected lungs based on the theory that this might allow the diseased tissue to heal. Patients were held down while surgeons broke their ribs and pulled them free. Many did not survive the procedure. Those who did were left permanently disfigured and still usually died of tuberculosis anyway. Other treatments included pneumothorax therapy, where doctors would deliberately collapse a patient's lung by inserting needles between the ribs to inject air into the chest cavity. Heliotherapy exposed patients to ultraviolet light and sunlight for hours, burning their skin in the hope that the radiation might kill the bacteria in their blood. Electroshock therapy was administered. Experimental medications with devastating side effects were tested on patients who had no other options. The screams of patients undergoing these procedures became so commonplace that staff members grew numb to the sound. Room 502 has become the focal point for countless paranormal investigations, and the legends surrounding this location are as dark as they are persistent. According to hospital records and local historians, Room 502 housed patients suffering from advanced tuberculosis during the sanatorium's operational years. But sometime in the 1920s or 30s, accounts vary. A nurse who worked in this room was found dead, having hanged herself from the light fixture. The official story, as much as one exists, suggests she was an unwed pregnant woman who committed suicide out of shame. Some versions of the legend claim she was pregnant by one of the doctors. Others say she had contracted tuberculosis herself and chose death over the slow deterioration the disease promised. What makes the story even more disturbing is that this was not the only suicide associated with Room 502. Several years later, according to testimony from former staff members, another nurse was found dead in the same room. Accounts differ on whether she jumped from the window or died by other means, but the pattern was established. Room 502 became known among the staff as cursed, a place where death waited for those who spent too much time within its walls. Modern paranormal investigators have documented dozens of unexplained experiences in Room 502. During an investigation conducted by the Atlantic Paranormal Society in 2006, team members reported seeing a full-bodied apparition of a woman in a white nurse's uniform standing in the corner of the room at 2:47 in the morning. The figure remained visible for approximately 8 seconds before fading away. Electronic voice phenomena recordings from that same investigation captured what sounds like a woman's voice saying, "Get out," when no living person was speaking. A security guard who worked overnight shifts at Waverly Hills from 2008 to 2012 provided testimony about his experiences in Room 502. He reported that on multiple occasions, he would hear the sound of a woman crying coming from inside the room, even though he was the only person in the building. When he would unlock the door to investigate, the crying would immediately stop. He also described feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness whenever he entered the room, a crushing depression that would lift as soon as he stepped back into the hallway. After 3 years of working in the building, he refused to enter Room 502 alone. But Room 502 is far from the only location within Waverly Hills where the boundary between past and present seems dangerously thin. The fourth-floor corridors have become infamous for shadow people, dark human-shaped figures that appear to walk the halls before vanishing through walls, or simply dissolving into darkness. Multiple investigation teams using thermal imaging cameras have captured footage of cold spots moving through the fourth floor in patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose. On one investigation in 2014, a team from the Louisville Ghost Hunters Society filmed what appeared to be a shadow figure, approximately 6 feet tall, moving down the corridor at 12:33 in the morning. The figure appeared to look directly at the camera before stepping through a closed door. A historian who has spent 15 years researching Waverly Hills and has unlimited access to the building for his work provided a compelling testimony. He is a skeptic by nature, someone who came to Waverly Hills to document its medical history rather than hunt for ghosts. But even he cannot explain what he witnessed on the 4th floor during a research visit in 2009. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, in broad daylight, he saw a dark figure standing at the end of the corridor. Assuming it was another visitor or a maintenance worker, he called out a greeting. The figure did not respond, but instead began walking toward him. As it grew closer, he realized he could see through it, could see the wall behind it even as the shadow maintained a solid human shape. He described feeling paralyzed, unable to move or look away as the figure passed within inches of him. He felt a wave of cold so intense it made his teeth chatter despite it being summer. Then the shadow was gone, and he was alone in the corridor. Perhaps the most heartbreaking of all the paranormal accounts from Waverly Hills involves the little girl. Multiple visitors and investigators have reported encounters with the spirit of a child, estimated to be between 6 and 8 years old, who appears primarily on the 3rd floor near what was once the children's ward. Witnesses describe feeling small hands touch their hair or tug at their clothing. Some have reported hearing a child's voice asking them to play. In several documented cases, people have felt their hair being braided by invisible hands. The tragedy becomes more profound when you consider the historical reality. Children did die at Waverly Hills, many of them. Tuberculosis did not discriminate by age. Young children were admitted to the sanatorium, separated from their families, subjected to painful and terrifying treatments they could not understand, and died alone in rooms that smelled of disinfectant and decay. Is it any wonder that some part of that suffering might linger? Waverly Hills Sanatorium closed as a tuberculosis hospital in 1961, after the development of antibiotics had finally given humanity a weapon against the White Death. The building was briefly reopened as Woodhaven Geriatrics Hospital in 1962, but that facility closed in 1982 amid reports of patient abuse and neglect. For years afterward, Waverly Hills stood abandoned, a decaying monument attracting vandals, curiosity seekers, and those drawn to darkness. In 2001, Charlie and Tina Mattingly purchased the property with the intention of preserving it and opening it to historical tours and paranormal investigations. Their work has allowed researchers, historians, and investigation teams to document the building thoroughly, creating what may be the most extensive collection of paranormal data ever assembled for a single location. But here is what we must understand about Waverly Hills. The ghosts, if they exist, are not the horror. The horror is what we did to each other in the name of healing. The horror is 64,000 people who came seeking hope and found only suffering. The horror is the desperation that drove doctors to break patients' ribs and collapse their lungs because they had nothing else to offer. The horror is children dying alone, calling for mothers who were not allowed to visit for fear of spreading infection. The paranormal activity reported at Waverly Hills, whether you believe it is real or simply the product of suggestion and shadow, is amplified by the very real tragedy that occurred there. Every unexplained sound, every shadow figure, every ghostly touch carries the weight of documented human suffering. This is not entertainment. This is not a thrill ride. This is a place where the boundary between life and death became so blurred that perhaps some part of those who died here truly did remain, trapped in their final moments of fear and pain. Waverly Hills Sanatorium represents a turning point, a place where horror transcends simple ghost stories and becomes something far more profound. It forces us to confront the reality that the worst horrors are not supernatural but human, born from our vulnerability to disease and our desperate attempts to fight death, even when the cost becomes unbearable. In the hills of western New York, there stands a building that bears witness to one of the most shameful chapters in American medical history. Rolling Hills Asylum, originally known as the Genesee County Poor Farm, operated from 1871 until the late 1970s, housing the destitute, the mentally ill, the elderly, and anyone society deemed unfit for the outside world. What happened within those limestone walls over more than a century represents not just institutional failure, but systematic dehumanization that reduced vulnerable people to little more than experimental subjects and forgotten souls. The records that survived paint a picture so disturbing that when investigators finally gained access to the facility in the 1970s, several refused to continue their work. The documentation reveals that Rolling Hills was never truly a hospital in any meaningful sense. It was a warehouse for human beings that society wanted to forget, operated with minimal oversight and even less compassion. The admission ledgers tell their own horror story. People were committed for reasons as trivial as being unmarried and pregnant, for speaking a language other than English, for poverty itself. One woman's file simply states she was admitted for being too passionate about politics. A man was confined because neighbors found him eccentric. Children were sent there because their parents died, and no relatives came forward. Once inside, these individuals entered a world that stripped them of every human dignity. The restraint methods used at Rolling Hills were documented in medical journals of the era, presented without shame as standard procedure. Patients were bound to beds using leather straps that cut into flesh, sometimes for days at a time. The Utica crib, a coffin-like cage where people were locked in a lying position for hours or even weeks, was used regularly. Staff records mention this device casually, noting its use for patients who showed agitation, apparently never questioning whether confinement in a box might cause rather than cure such distress. The tranquilizer chair, a restraint device that immobilized every limb while applying pressure to the head, was another favorite tool. Patients placed in this chair would sometimes be left there through multiple staff shifts, developing bed sores and circulation problems that were then treated as separate medical issues, rather than consequences of torture. One nurse's diary, preserved in the County Historical Society, mentions a woman who spent so long in restraints that her muscles atrophied and she never walked again. The nurse noted this as an unfortunate complication rather than a predictable result of barbaric treatment. The isolation rooms at Rolling Hills were nothing more than stone cells with a single barred window placed too high to see out of. These rooms, located in the basement where temperature regulation was non-existent, became tombs for the living. Patients were sent there for infractions as minor as speaking out of turn or refusing to eat. The winter of 1934 saw 3 deaths in isolation rooms, all attributed to pneumonia in the official records, though the actual cause was hypothermia combined with neglect. A maintenance worker's report from that year mentions finding ice on the interior walls of these cells. The living conditions throughout the facility resembled a prison, far more than any healthcare setting. By the 1940s, Rolling Hills housed more than 3 times its intended capacity. Beds were pushed together so tightly that staff could barely walk between them. Privacy did not exist. Toilets sat in open areas where dozens of people could watch. Bathing occurred in assembly line fashion, with patients stripped and hosed down in groups, the water often cold because the facility's ancient boiler could not keep up with demand. Food was scarce and of such poor quality that malnutrition was endemic. A 1953 inspection report describes the kitchen as a health hazard, noting rat droppings in food storage areas and meat that had turned green being prepared for patient meals. The inspector recommended immediate closure, but political pressure from county officials who did not want to lose the federal funding that came with operating such a facility kept it open for another 2 decades. The experimental procedures conducted at Rolling Hills were perhaps the most egregious violations of all. Without consent, without explanation, vulnerable people became test subjects for treatments that ranged from questionable to outright torture. Hydrotherapy, which sounds benign, actually involved strapping patients into tubs of ice-cold water for hours, a technique that caused several deaths from shock and hypothermia. The medical rationale, such as it was, claimed this would calm excited patients, but records show it was often used as punishment. Insulin shock therapy was administered regularly in the 1940s and 50s. Patients were injected with massive doses of insulin to induce seizures and comas, a procedure with no proven therapeutic benefit but substantial risk of brain damage and death. The consent forms for these procedures, when they existed at all, were signed by facility administrators rather than patients or their families. People were subjected to treatment that permanently altered their brain function without ever being told what was being done to them. Electroshock therapy at Rolling Hills was particularly brutal because it was often administered without anesthesia or muscle relaxants, which became standard practice elsewhere. Patients were simply strapped down, shocked, their bodies convulsing so violently that broken bones were common. A doctor's notes from 1957 mention administering electroshock to a patient 43 times in a single month, each session stronger than the last because the desired behavioral change had not occurred. That patient died 3 months later, the cause of death listed simply as seizure disorder, though the connection to repeated electrical trauma went unnoted in official records. The voices of the victims themselves are heartbreaking when we can hear them at all. Very few patient testimonies survived, because the people confined at Rolling Hills were systematically denied the right to communicate with the outside world. Letters were intercepted and destroyed. Visitors were turned away or told that patients were too unwell to see them. However, some accounts did emerge. A woman who spent 12 years at Rolling Hills after being committed for depression in her 20s later testified before state investigators. She described watching a young man beaten so severely by orderlies for refusing medication that he never regained consciousness. She spoke of women giving birth alone in their beds because staff would not believe their labor pains were real. She remembered a child, perhaps 8 years old, who arrived at the facility and simply stopped speaking, sitting motionless until he wasted away over the course of 6 months. The closure of Rolling Hills finally came in 1974, not because of sudden moral awakening, but because investigative journalists gained access to the facility and published photographs that shocked the public conscience. Images of people restrained to beds, of overcrowded wards that looked like concentration camps, of isolation cells caked with human waste appeared in newspapers across New York State. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. State inspectors, who had previously filed reports recommending improvements but allowing continued operation, suddenly ordered immediate shutdown. The transition out was chaotic and revealed just how institutionalized residents had become. Many had spent their entire adult lives inside Rolling Hills and had no family willing or able to take them. They were transferred to other facilities or simply released to the streets with no support systems. The building sat empty for years, a monument to collective shame that no one wanted to acknowledge or address. Today, Rolling Hills operates as a paranormal tourism destination, and the reported phenomena are among the most disturbing in any haunted location worldwide. Visitors consistently describe feeling invisible hands grabbing their wrists and ankles, mimicking the restraints that bound patients for decades. The sensation is specific enough that people can describe exactly where the pressure occurs, often matching the placement of historical restraint devices they had no knowledge of. Some visitors have emerged from tours with unexplained bruises and patterns consistent with leather strap placement. The sounds reported at Rolling Hills are particularly harrowing. Screams echo through empty hallways, not the theatrical moans of ghost stories, but genuine cries of anguish and terror. People hear pleading voices begging for release, for mercy, for someone to listen. In the basement isolation rooms, visitors report hearing rhythmic banging as though someone is pounding on the walls, combined with sobbing that seems to come from the stones themselves. These sounds have been captured on audio recordings, analyzed by skeptics who cannot explain them as building settling or environmental noise. Shadow figures at Rolling Hills behave differently than at most supposedly haunted locations. Rather than fleeing when noticed, these dark forms approach observers, sometimes surrounding them. Multiple visitors have described a sensation of being watched by something deeply angry, something that radiates hostility and pain in equal measure. In the former medical wing, a shadow figure has been photographed dozens of times, always in the same location, always seeming to reach toward the camera with elongated arms. Witnesses say this figure follows them, staying just at the edge of vision, creating a sense of dread that intensifies the longer they remain in the building. Yet we must be absolutely clear about one essential truth. Whatever paranormal activity may or may not exist at Rolling Hills pales into insignificance compared to the documented horrors inflicted by living people upon other living people within those walls. The real terror of this place is not spectral. It is historical. It is the verified record of human cruelty, of systemic abuse cloaked in medical authority, of vulnerable people stripped of dignity and subjected to treatment that violated every ethical principle we claim to hold sacred. The haunting legends surrounding Rolling Hills exist because the suffering was so profound, so prolonged, and so unjust that we struggle to process it rationally. The ghost stories become a way to acknowledge pain that is otherwise too overwhelming to confront directly. When we speak of restless spirits, we are really speaking about our own restless consciences, our collective guilt for what was allowed to happen. The victims of Rolling Hills deserve more than paranormal tourism. They deserve to be remembered as people who suffered unjustly, whose stories reveal the darkest capabilities of institutional power unchecked by compassion or accountability. Their names, when we know them, should be spoken. Their experiences, however difficult, should be taught as cautionary history. Because the true horror is not that the building might be haunted, but that the atrocities committed there were real, documented, and allowed to continue for over a century. The human mind is a pattern-seeking machine, evolved over millions of years to find meaning in chaos, to detect threats in shadows, to make sense of a world that often defies simple explanation. This remarkable ability has kept our species alive, allowing us to predict dangers, recognize opportunities, and navigate complex social landscapes. But this same gift, this relentless drive to find patterns and meaning, can also deceive us in the most profound ways. When we step into an abandoned asylum, a decaying hospital, or any building steeped in tragedy, our brains begin working overtime, processing thousands of sensory inputs and filtering them through layers of expectation, memory, and fear. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't diminish the power of what people experience in these locations. Instead, it reveals something perhaps even more fascinating than ghosts or spirits: the incredible complexity of human perception and the ways our environment shapes our reality. Consider for a moment what happens to your body when you enter a long-abandoned building. Before you even register conscious thought, your nervous system has already begun responding to invisible forces. Many old institutional structures, particularly those built in the late 1800s and early 1900s, produce what scientists call infrasound, sound waves vibrating at frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, typically below 20 Hz. These low-frequency vibrations can be generated by wind moving through long corridors, old machinery still humming in forgotten basements, or even the settling of massive stone and concrete structures. Your ears cannot detect these sounds, but your body absolutely can. Research conducted by engineers and psychologists has demonstrated that exposure to infrasound can produce a startling array of physical and psychological effects. Dr. Vic Tandy, a British researcher and lecturer, made a groundbreaking discovery in the 1990s when he began investigating his own unsettling experiences in what was reportedly a haunted laboratory. He noticed that a particular spot in the room filled him with inexplicable dread, and he even reported seeing a gray, shadowy figure in his peripheral vision. Rather than accepting a supernatural explanation, Tandy investigated further and discovered that a recently installed extraction fan was producing sound waves at exactly 19 Hz. This frequency, he found, was causing his eyeballs to resonate in their sockets, creating visual distortions that appeared as shadowy figures. When the fan was turned off, the apparitions ceased. This finding opened up entirely new avenues of research into reported hauntings. Infrasound at frequencies between 16 and 20 Hz can cause feelings of anxiety, extreme sorrow, and nervous feelings of revulsion. It can make your eyes vibrate, creating the illusion of movement in your peripheral vision. It can cause chest pressure that feels like an oppressive presence. It can even induce the sensation that someone is standing directly behind you. When you combine these physiological responses with the knowledge that you're standing in a location where terrible things occurred, where hundreds of people suffered and died, your brain begins constructing a narrative that makes sense of these unsettling sensations. The narrative it chooses is often supernatural because that's the framework you've been primed to expect. This brings us to one of the most powerful psychological mechanisms at play in reportedly haunted locations: priming. Priming is the phenomenon where exposure to one stimulus influences your response to subsequent stimuli. When you know you're entering an asylum where patients were subjected to cruel treatments, where people died in restraints, where the desperate and forgotten spent their final days, your brain has already been loaded with a specific interpretive framework. Every creaking floorboard, every shadow, every unexpected sound gets filtered through this lens of expectation. You're not experiencing these stimuli neutrally. You're experiencing them through the story you've already been told. Environmental psychologists have conducted numerous studies demonstrating how powerfully our surroundings influence our emotional states and perception. Dr. Colin Ellard, a cognitive neuroscientist and author, has extensively researched how architectural spaces affect human psychology. He notes that certain design elements common to institutional buildings like asylums, prisons, and old hospitals create what he calls environmental stress. Long, repetitive corridors with uniform doors suggest endlessness and disorientation. High ceilings and large, empty rooms can make individuals feel small, vulnerable, and exposed. The absence of natural light disrupts our circadian rhythms and can induce depression and anxiety even during short visits. Peeling paint, broken windows, and visible decay trigger deep-seated associations with disease, death, and abandonment. These architectural and environmental factors work on us at a subconscious level. When you walk through a ward where the walls are stained with water damage and mold, where metal bed frames rust in corners, where shattered glass crunches underfoot, your nervous system registers all of this as a threat environment. Your amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for processing fear and emotional responses, becomes hyperactive. Your stress hormones elevate. Your senses sharpen. You enter a state of heightened vigilance, where you're primed to interpret ambiguous information as potentially dangerous. In this state, the sound of wind through a broken window might register as a whisper. A reflection in old glass might appear as a figure. The natural settling of an old building might sound like footsteps approaching from behind. Dr. Christopher French, a psychologist who heads the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit at the University of London, has spent decades studying why people report paranormal experiences. His research consistently points to the role of suggestion and expectation in shaping perception. In controlled studies, participants who are told that a location is haunted report significantly more unusual experiences than those in identical environments who weren't given that information. The difference isn't in what's actually happening in the environment. The difference is entirely in the perceiver's interpretive framework. When you expect to encounter something paranormal, your brain becomes exceptionally good at finding evidence to support that expectation, a phenomenon known as confirmation bias. But here's where the analysis becomes more nuanced and more respectful of genuine human experience. Acknowledging these psychological and environmental factors doesn't mean that what people experience isn't real. The fear is real. The sense of presence is real. The emotional impact is absolutely real. When someone reports feeling overwhelming sadness in a room where patients suffered, they're not making it up or being foolish. They're responding to a complex web of environmental cues, historical knowledge, and empathetic imagination. The human capacity for empathy is so profound that we can feel echoes of past suffering, even when mediated through knowledge rather than supernatural transmission. This concept of spaces holding memory is particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective. Collective memory, the shared pool of knowledge and experiences held by a group or society, can create what feels like a tangible presence in certain locations. When thousands of people have visited a site, all carrying the same stories, all expecting similar experiences, all contributing their accounts to the growing legend, the location becomes layered with meaning. Each visitor adds to this collective understanding, reinforcing the narrative and making it more real in the social and psychological sense. The building itself becomes a canvas onto which we project our cultural anxieties about madness, suffering, institutional failure, and death. Neuroscientist Dr. Dean Mobbs, who studies fear and anxiety in the human brain, notes that our brains are remarkably poor at distinguishing between threats that are immediate and physical versus those that are imagined or symbolic. When you're walking through a dark corridor in an abandoned asylum, the fear you feel is neurologically identical to the fear you'd experience if you were actually in danger. Your brain doesn't care that the threat is likely imagined. It responds as if it's real, flooding your system with adrenaline, sharpening your attention, and creating vivid, emotionally charged memory. This is why people's accounts of paranormal experiences feel so genuine and so powerful to them. In terms of brain activity and bodily response, they absolutely were experiencing something intense and frightening. The role of pattern recognition in creating ghostly experiences cannot be overstated. Humans are evolutionarily programmed to detect faces and human forms, even in abstract patterns. This tendency, called pareidolia, served our ancestors well when detecting predators or fellow humans in complex natural environments. But in settings full of peeling wallpaper, stained walls, and random patterns of light and shadow, this ability goes into overdrive. We see faces in textured walls. We perceive human forms in the way shadows fall across doorways. Our brains are so committed to finding these patterns that we often see them, even when we intellectually know they're not there. Yet even as we explore these scientific explanations, we must hold space for the profound emotional truth of these locations. When you stand in a room where electroshock therapy was administered without anesthesia, where lobotomies were performed, where people screamed for help that never came, you're not just in an empty room. You're standing at the intersection of history, memory, and moral reckoning. The weight you feel might not be supernatural, but it's not imaginary either. It's the weight of historical trauma, of lives that mattered but were treated as if they didn't, of suffering that demands to be acknowledged. Trauma does leave marks on spaces, not through ghostly residue but through the stories we tell, the records we keep, and the collective moral consciousness we carry forward. These buildings stand as monuments to what we've done and what we must never do again. When people report feeling watched in these places, perhaps what they're really feeling is the weight of witness, the responsibility of remembering, the uncomfortable knowledge that similar institutions still exist, that suffering continues, that we haven't fully learned the lessons these buildings were meant to teach us. The most intellectually honest approach acknowledges both the scientific explanations and the genuine significance of these experiences. Yes, infrasound can make you feel dread. Yes, environmental factors create anxiety. Yes, psychological priming shapes perception. And yes, these places matter deeply, hold real historical weight, and deserve to be approached with solemnity and respect. The goal isn't to debunk or dismiss, but to understand more fully, to appreciate the complexity of human perception, and to recognize that sometimes the truth is more layered and interesting than simple explanations, whether supernatural or purely skeptical, can capture. We stand now at the threshold between memory and forgetting, looking back at the darkened corridors we've walked together through these abandoned schools and asylums. These buildings, with their peeling paint and shattered windows, hold more than dust and decay. They hold something essential about who we are as a society, something we desperately need to understand. The ghosts that walk these halls, if they exist at all, are not merely restless spirits trapped between worlds. They are reflections staring back at us from broken mirrors, forcing us to confront truths we've tried to bury beneath decades of silence and institutional amnesia. Every abandoned classroom with its empty desks, every asylum corridor lined with locked doors, stands as physical evidence of our collective failure. These are the spaces where we sent our most vulnerable, the children we failed to protect, and the mentally ill we failed to heal, and then tried our best to forget. The urban explorers who navigate these ruins with flashlights and cameras, the paranormal investigators who spend nights recording electronic voice phenomena and temperature anomalies, they are performing a service more profound than they perhaps realize. They are bearing witness. They are refusing to let these places and their stories disappear completely into the comfortable fog of forgotten history. In their own way, they are preserving cultural memory, keeping alive the truth that these institutions existed, that real people suffered here, that promises were broken on a massive scale. The question that haunts us most persistently is whether these buildings are truly occupied by supernatural entities or whether they're haunted by something even more disturbing, our own unprocessed guilt and cultural trauma. When we feel a chill in an abandoned school hallway, are we sensing the presence of a child who died there? Or are we finally feeling the weight of how many children were abused, neglected, punished for being different? When we hear whispers in asylum wards, are they voices from beyond, or echoes of our society's shameful history of treating mental illness with cruelty instead of compassion? The answer perhaps is that it doesn't matter. Whether the hauntings are paranormal or psychological, they serve the same essential purpose. They keep us from looking away. They make these spaces impossible to ignore completely, even as nature reclaims them and time erodes their structures. The stories persist because the guilt persists, because we haven't fully reckoned with what happened in these places, because the vulnerable populations we failed then are still being failed today in new institutions, under new names, with new bureaucratic justifications. These haunted buildings call us to remember, not to sensationalize the suffering that occurred within their walls, but to learn from it, to let it change us. The children who were beaten in reform schools, the patients who were subjected to experimental treatments, the countless individuals who died alone and forgotten, they deserve more than to become ghost story fodder. They deserve to be remembered as human beings, as evidence of what happens when institutions prioritize control over care, punishment over healing, efficiency over humanity. And so we must ask ourselves, as we leave these haunted spaces behind and return to our modern world, what buildings are we constructing now that future generations will explore with horror and disbelief? What institutional failures are we perpetuating that our descendants will struggle to understand? How will they judge the way we treat our most vulnerable, the way we fund or defund mental health services, the way we address childhood trauma, the way we incarcerate rather than heal? These questions transform our ghost hunt into something more urgent, a mirror turned toward the present. The true haunting isn't in the past at all. It's in the recognition that we carry these patterns forward, that without conscious effort and systemic change, we are building tomorrow's haunted institutions today. May we learn from the ghosts, real or imagined, and choose differently. May we remember these spaces not with morbid fascination, but with the solemn commitment to never again abandon those who need us most. The spirits can finally rest when we stop creating new reasons for haunting. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen.